The House of the Wolfings. Chapter 23. Theodulf meeteth the Romans in the Wolfing meadow. It was scarce an hour after this that the footmen of Theodulf came out of the thicket road on to the meadow of the Bearings. There saw they men gathered on a rising ground. And they came up to them and saw how some of them were looking with troubled faces towards the ford and what lay beyond it, and some toward the wood and the coming of Theodulf. But these were they whom Otter had bidden abide Theodulf there, and he had sent 2 messengers to them for Theodulf's behoof, that he might have due tidings so soon as he came out of the thicket. The first told how Otter had been compelled in a manner to fall on the Romans along with the riders of the Bearings and the Wormings, and the second, who had but just then come, told how the Marmen had been worsted by the Romans, and had given back from the Wolfing dwellings and were making a stand against the foemen in the meadow betwixt the ford and Wolfstead. Now when Theodulf heard of these tidings, he stayed not to ask long questions, but led the whole host straightway down to the ford, lest the remnant of Otter's men should be driven down there, and the Romans should hold the western bank against him. At the ford there was none to withstand them, nor indeed any man at all, for the men whom Otter had set there, when they heard that the battle had gone against their kindred, had ridden their ways to join them. So Theodulf crossed over the ford, he and his in good order, all afoot, he like to the others, but for him he was clad in the dwarf-wrought hauberk, but was unhelmeted and bare no shield. Throngplow was naked in his hand as he came up all dripping on to the bank and stood in the meadow of the Wolfings. His face was stern and set as he gazed straight onward to the place of the fray, but he did not look as joyous as his wont was in going down to the battle. Now they had gone but a short way from the ford before the noise of the fight and the blowing of horns came down the wind to them, but it was a little way further before they saw the fray with their eyes, because the ground fell away from the river somewhat at first, and then rose and fell again before it went up in one slope toward the Wolfing dwellings. But when they were come to the top of the next swelling of the ground, they beheld from thence what they had to deal with, for their round about a ground of vantage was the field black with the Roman host, and in the midst of it was a tangle of struggling men and tossing spears and glittering swords. So when they beheld the battle of their kindred, they gave a great shout and hastened onward the faster, and they were ordered into the wedge array, and Theodulf led them, as meet it was. And now even as they who were on the outward edge of the array and could see what was toward were looking on the battle with eager eyes, there came an answering shout down the wind, which they knew for the voice of the Goths amid the foemen. And then they saw how the ring of the Romans shook and parted, and their array fell back, and lo, the company of the Markmen standing stoutly together, though sorely minished, and sure it was that they had not fled or been scattered, but were ready to fall, one over another in one band, for there were no men straggling towards the ford, though many masterless horses ran here and there about the meadow. Now therefore none doubted but that they would deliver their friends from the Romans and overthrow the foemen. But now befell a wonder, a strange thing to tell of. The Romans soon perceived what was a-doing, whereupon the half of them turned about to face the newcomers, while the other half still withstood the company of Otter. The wedge array of Theodulf drew nearer and nearer till it was hard on the place where it should spread itself out to storm down on the foe, and the Goths beset by the Romans made them ready to fall on from their side. There was Theodulf leading his host, and all men looking for the token and sign to fall on, but even as he lifted up Throngplow to give that sign, a cloud came over his eyes, and he saw not of all that was before him. And he staggered back as one who hath gotten a deadly stroke, and so fell swooning to the earth, though none had smitten him. Then stayed was the wedge array even at the very point of onset, and the hearts of the Goths sank, for they deemed that their leader was slain, and those who were nearest to him raised him up and bore him hastily aback out of the battle. And the Romans also had beheld him fall, and they also deemed him dead or sore hurt, and shouted for joy and loitered not, but stormed forth on the wedge array like valiant men, for it must be told that they, who erst outnumbered the company of Otter, were now much outnumbered, but they deemed it might well be that they could dismay the Goths, since they had been stayed by the fall of their leader, and Otter's company were wearied with sore fighting against a great host. Nevertheless these last, who had not seen the fall of Theodulf, for the Romans were thick between him and them, fell on with such exceeding fury that they drove the Romans who faced them back on those who had set on the wedge array, which also stood fast undismayed. For he who stood next to Theodulf, a man big of body and stout of heart, hight Thorolf, hove up a great axe and cried out aloud, "Here is the next man to Theodulf. Here is one who will not fall till some one thrusts him over. Here is Thorolf of the Wolfings. Stand fast and shield you and smite, though Theodulf be gone untimely to the gods." So none gave back a foot, and fierce was the fight about the wedge array and the men of Otter, but there was no Otter there, and many another man was gone. And Arimbiorn the old led them. These stormed on so fiercely that they cleft their way through all and joined themselves to their kindred, and the battle was renewed in the Wolfing meadow. But the Romans had this gain that Theodulf's men had let go their occasion for falling on the Romans with their lines spread out so that every man might use his weapons, yet were the Goths strong both in valiancy and in numbers. Nor might the Romans break into their array, and as aforesaid the Romans were the fewer, for it was less than half of their host that had pursued the Goths when they had been thrust back from their fierce onset, nor did more than the half seem needed, so many of them had fallen along with Otter the Warduke and Swinebiorn of the Barings, that they seemed to the Romans but a feeble band easy to overcome. So fought they in the Wolfing meadow in the 5th hour after high noon, and neither yielded to the other. But while these things were doing, men laid Theodulf down aloof from the battle under a doddered oak half a furlong from where the fight was doing, round whose bole clung flocks of wool from the sheep that drew around it in the hot summertide and rubbed themselves against it, and the ground was trodden bare of grass round the bole, and close to the trunk was worn into a kind of trench. There then they laid Theodulf, and they wondered that no blood came from him, and that there was no sign of a shot weapon in his body. But as for him, when he fell, all memory of the battle and what had gone before it faded from his mind, and he passed into sweet and pleasant dreams wherein he was a lad again in the days before he had fought with the 3 Hun kings in the hazelled field. And in these dreams he was doing after the manner of young lads, sporting in the meadows, backing unbroken colts, swimming in the river, going hunting with the elder carles. And especially he deemed that he was in the company of one old man who had taught him both woodcraft and the handling of weapons, and fair at first was his dream of his doings with this man. He was with him in the forge smithying a sword blade, and hammering into its steel the thin golden wires, and fishing with an angle along with him by the eddies of Mirkwood water, and sitting with him in an ingle of the hall, the old man telling a tale of an ancient warrior of the Wolfings hight Theodulf. Also, then suddenly and without going there, they were in a little clearing of the woods resting after hunting, a roe deer with an arrow in her lying at their feet, and the old man was talking and telling Theodulf in what wise it was best to go about to get the wind of a heart, but all the while there was going on the thunder of a great gale of wind through the woodland boughs, even as the drone of a bagpipe cleaves to the tune. Presently Theodulf arose and would go about his hunting again, and stooped to take up his spear, and even therewith the old man's speech stayed, and Theodulf looked up, and lo, his face was white like stone, and he touched him, and he was hard as flint, and like the image of an ancient god as to his face and hands, though the wind stirred his hair and his raiment as they did before. Therewith a great pang smote Theodulf in his dream, and he felt as if he also were stiffening into stone, and he strove and struggled, and lo, the wild wood was gone, and a white light empty of all vision was before him. And as he moved his head this became the Wolfing meadow as he had known it so long, and thereat a soft pleasure and joy took hold of him, till again he looked, and saw there no longer the kine and sheep and the herdwomen tending them, but the rush and turmoil of that fierce battle, the confused thundering noise of which was going up to the heavens, for indeed he was now fully awake again. So he stood up and looked about, and around him was a ring of the sorrowful faces of the warriors who had deemed that he was hurt deadly, though no hurt could they find upon him. But the dwarf-wrought hauberk lay upon the ground beside him, for they had taken it off him to look for his hurts. So he looked into their faces and said, "What aileth you, ye men? I am alive and unhurt, what hath betided?" And one said, "Art thou verily alive, or a man come back from the dead? We saw thee fall as thou wentest leading us against the foe, as if thou hadst been smitten by a thunderbolt, and we deemed thee dead or grievously hurt. Now the carles are fighting stoutly, and all is well since thou livest yet." So he said, "Give me the point and edges that I know, that I may smite myself therewith, and not the foemen, for I have feared and blenched from the battle." Said an old warrior, "If that be so, Theodulf, wilt thou blench twice? Is not once enough? Now let us go back to the hard handplay, and if thou wilt, smite thyself after the battle, when we have once more had a man's help of thee." Therewith he held out Throngplow to him by the point, and Theodulf took hold of the hilts and handled it, and said, "Let us hasten, while the gods will have it so, and while they are still suffering me to strike a stroke for the kindred." And therewith he brandished Throngplow, and went forth toward the battle, and the heart grew hot within him, and the joy of waking life came back to him, the joy which but erewhile he had given to a mere dream. But the old man who had rebuked him stooped down and lifted the hauberk from the ground, and cried out after him, "O Theodulf, and wilt thou go naked into so strong a fight? And thou with this so goodly sword rampart?" Theodulf stayed a moment, and even therewith they looked, and lo, the Romans giving back before the Goths, and the Goths following up the chase, but slowly and steadily. Then Theodulf heeded nothing save the battle, but ran forward hastily, and those warriors followed him, the old man last of all holding the hauberk in his hand, and muttering, "So fares hot blood to the glooming and the world beneath the grass, and the fruit of the Wolfing's orchard in a flash from the world must pass. Men say that the tree shall blossom in the garden of the folk, and the new twig thrust him forward from the place where the old one broke, and all be well as aforetime, but old and old I grow, and I doubt me if such another the folk to come shall know. And he still hurried forward as fast as his old body might go, so that he might wrap the safeguard of the hauberk round Theodulf's body.